we have to start thinking about Parkinson in a different way. It's not just a brain disease, and it's not just a disease of dopamine. There are certainly multiple circuits in the brain.
Ray, Michael, just sort of talking to me about, Parkinson's, what is it? Give us a little background on the biology of it, and then the increasing incidence of it, and what you think are the major reasons why we're seeing this dramatic increasing incidence. It's like orders of magnitude. It's not just like a 10 or 20% increase.
Parkinson's, the first major description of the disease was by Dr. James Parkinson in 1817 in London. So he's 61. He's a surgeon, actually, and he's actually even a geologist, and he sees something new on the streets of London, something so new that at 61, he bothers to write a case series. He basically writes his case series on 6 people, at least five of whom are men. They're all older, and they have tremor, which has long since been described, but they have this stoop posture, this hunched posture, and this tendency to walk faster and faster and to fall forward. And he said in 1817, this has not been described in the medical literature.
Really?
This is
1817.
So in 1817, Dr. Parkinson says that the disease that became known as Parkinson's has not been described in the medical literature. Ergo, I'm describing something new.
And this was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
And it's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And where is it? It's in London.
Yeah.
And air quality in 1800 London is equivalent to what is in Delhi, India today. It's equivalent to what was over New York City with the Canadian wildfires, remember 2 or 3 summers ago?
Yeah.
The skies turned orange. That was everyday 1800 London.
Yeah.
So I think Dr. Parkinson is describing the effects of chronic exposure to high levels of air pollution. And so Parkinson's, we think
and by the way, it was coal.
Coal.
Because coal was what they used to heat and do industry with, and that's full of mercury and lead.
Exactly. And so we look in the brains of people with Parkinson's, they have high levels of heavy metal. And so when you look at smog in LA, for example, you're seeing little pieces of dirt and soot that are suspended in the air. The fancy term is particulate matter. Most of them we cough out or sneeze out, but some are so small, less than 1/30th the width of our hair. They penetrate the nerve that hangs down, the responsible for smell that hangs down in our nasal passages. And hitchhiking on those pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals.
Wow. So it's a superhighway from your nose to your brain.
It's the front door to your brain.
Wow.
And it's the blood-brain barrier you remember from medical school, right? Doesn't let things in.
Well, kind of it does.
But it kind of does. But this
It's a little leaky.
But this is the front door. Doesn't go through the blood-brain barrier. It's just going through the olfactory nerve, the nerve responsible for smell that's hanging it. And it's hitchhiking are these metals, lead from gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And so people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's both have high levels of metals in their brain. No one's really been able to explain why, but I think one of the reasons why is air pollution, which is one of the toxins that are inhaled that lead to Parkinson's.
Yeah, we're exposed to, we're exposed to mercury in the fish we eat. Lead is, in their food. And, if you eat a lot of kale, it's grown in urban environments, it just picks up all the lead. What you said was so interesting to me about the leaky brain, because, when I was in sort of my early years of practicing, we were talking about a leaky gut, and I used to get laughed at all the time by traditional doctors because they're like, "Oh, that's nonsense. It's just, you're quack." And for a long time, I've also basically been saying that there's a leaky brain. Well, Michael, you sort of brought this to attention because I think people don't really understand what that is. Leaky gut is when the barrier breaks down and food and poop leak in and affect your immune system and then start to cause all kinds of havoc. And as you mentioned, Michael, that you basically have this barrier, this blood-brain barrier, but it becomes permeable, and then all of a sudden things get in from the outside. So it's not like completely impenetrable barrier. And I think we're seeing increasingly things that cause a leaky brain, like stress and many other things like toxins. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this leaky brain phenomenon, because it's really how the toxins get into the brain that are causing all these problems. When you do biopsies and you're finding toxins and heavy metals in the brains, like what's happening?
Yeah, and you're absolutely, spot on when you talk about leaky gut too. And it turns out the gut is also a pathway, where you can hitchhike in and potentially cause Parkinson as well. And we talk about now brain first Parkinson and gut first Parkinson. And so this leakiness, this permeability to stress and other factors that can get across is really important. So if you think about the brain as having like a force field, if you're a Star Wars fan, it's kind of got like a force field. And we've always kind of taught all the medical students, we've taught everybody in medicine that this is this impenetrable force field. Nothing's going to get through this force field. It's actually not correct. Not only is it not right, but as we develop, treatments and as we develop, different, therapies, we're actually able to defeat the blood-brain barrier is what we call it, or the BBB. We're able to defeat that. And it's so super important for us to remember that things can get through it. We can use that for therapeutics. We can also need to be thinking about that for cause and getting to the root cause of Parkinson. And one of the things
treatment.
And even treatment. But one other thing I just wanted to bring into the discussion, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the gut, is there's a big myth about Parkinson. And the myth is that it's just a brain disease.
Yeah.
It's a whole body disease, Mark. And we see it in the gut. We see the proteins in the gut. We see it in the skin. We see it in multiple systems. And so we
proteins
need
that are expressed in the body in Parkinson.
Absolutely. And so
misfolded.
And misfolded. I mean, we have twice the risk of malignant skin cancer, melanoma and Parkinson disease, twice the risk of osteoporosis and Parkinson disease. This is a whole body disease. And as we think about it, and I love, kind of how you describe yourself as someone that thinks of everyone, thinks of the whole, we have to start thinking about Parkinson in a different way. It's not just a brain disease, and it's not just a disease of dopamine. There are certainly multiple circuits in the brain. And then, this barrier that we, have, invested so much in all of our textbooks, we've got to rewrite those.
We're officially in the thick of holiday season, and while everyone's rushing around doing their shopping, I want you to think about something different this year. What if instead of just buying stuff, you gave the gift of health to yourself and the people you love? Because let's be honest, health is the foundation of everything. Now, I'm excited to share something we've never done before. We're offering 30% off the 10-day detox, founding member rates for the Hyman Hive, and 20% off all our supplement stacks, foundational, sleep, fertility, immune health, heart health, and lots more. If you're ready to reset your own health, or you want to give someone you care about the tools to feel better, now is the time. And this sale runs just through December 2nd, so don't miss it. It's such an unfortunate problem we have now because as we're beginning to understand the body as a network or as a system, network biology, traditional medicine is organized according to parts like geography. Where is it in your body? Is it your head? Is it your stomach? Is it your joint? Is it your knee? Like whatever. So you've got all these specialists that are specialized in their organ. But if you start to read across specialties, you see there's these common themes that are like inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, the microbiome involvement, misfolded proteins, things like all these things you're talking about aren't just about neurology. They're about everything. And so that's why, you can start to really help people by understanding how these systems.
And we miss it, Mark. So we miss the point and we miss the diagnosis and we miss the treatments and we miss the approaches because no one takes a step back. Mm-hmm. Everybody's doing their super, specialists, and Ray and I are completely guilty. We're guilty of a lot of things, Mark, but we're definitely guilty of being super specialists, right? Yeah. On top of, neurology, which is already a specialty, then we have a subspecialty of Parkinson and basal ganglia and all these crazy brain circuits, right? Yeah. And so we have to step back, create navigators for people that are, suffering and dealing with these symptoms, and help to think of this as a whole body disease.
It really is. And we were chit-chatting before, and I mentioned this paper I read, 20 years ago. It was in JAMA, I think. And I forget the exact title, but it was essentially explaining how the biology of Parkinson's disease and what happens. And, one of the key things we talk about in functional medicine is the mitochondria, which is our energy system, how we take food and oxygen and combust it in our cells. And through a very series of steps, we actually can produce ATP or energy that runs the body. And ultimately, the end result of what's happening, and you can explain this probably better than I can, is there's mitochondrial damage, particularly in the area of the brain we call the basal ganglia, that is responsible for movement. So this is a movement disorder. Tell us about the increasing incidence of this and why we're seeing so much more. It's not just the prevalence, which will grow as the population grows, but the actual incidence of how many new cases per population is actually happening, and why we're seeing this accelerate over the last 50 years.
Yeah. So when Dr. Parkinson described it, he described 6 people in 1817 with the disease. 2017, the Global Burden of Disease study estimates 6 million people have the disease. How do you go from 6 to 6 million in 200 years? Aging alone doesn't explain it. Adjusted for age, the rise of Parkinson's is going up 60%, far faster than Alzheimer's disease, 60% adjusted for age.
Which is shocking, right?
Yeah.
Did you just say faster than Alzheimer's?
And Alzheimer's is going very fast.
Yeah.
It can't be genetics because our genes, don't change, generally speaking, for just 200 years. So it has to be in our environment. And if you look at a map of the world, areas of the world that are most industrialized, like the US and Canada, have the highest rates of the disease. Areas of the world that are least industrialized, like Sub-Saharan Africa, adjusted for age, have the lowest rates of the disease.
Yeah.
And areas of the world undergoing the most rapid industrialization and pollution, India and China, have the fastest increasing rates of the disease. And so these chemicals, the ones that are implicating Parkinson's disease, are all mitochondrial toxins, means that they damage the energy-producing parts of cells. You know that the brain is only 2% of our body weight, but 30% of our energy consumption is going to the brain. And nerve cells are the chief drivers of that. 75% of energy demands are from nerve cells or neurons.
Right.
And so these toxins, whether it's sort of air pollution, whether it's dry cleaning chemicals, if you can believe it, whether it's pesticides, they all damage the energy-producing parts of the cell. Some of them we inhale, some we ingest. Some Parkinson's disease begins in the nose. Some Parkinson's disease begins in the gut, right? So when Parkinson described the condition, he thought it began in the brain. So I'm describing a brain disease. It must begin in the brain. Actually, Parkinson's disease, Per Borgheimer, one of our colleagues in Denmark, says that there are 2 forms of Parkinson's. One that's brain or nose first, pathology beginning in the nose, and one that's body or gut first, pathology beginning in the gut.
Yeah, interesting.
And so these toxins, I said to him, I emailed them. I read all his papers. I printed them out on my Sunday evening and Sunday afternoon. I just read them all. And I marked them up with my pen. And I'm like, holy cow. And I emailed him. I said, well, how does this fit with like chemicals that we eat or swallow or ingest, leading to a gut first form of the disease, and chemicals that we inhale? He was skeptical at first, but we wrote a paper called The Body, the Brain, the Environment in Parkinson's Disease, arguing that Parkinson's disease that begins in the gut is due to chemicals that you ingest, like well water that's contaminated with pesticides. Chemicals that you inhale leads to a nose first. Chemicals that you breathe in, like if you live near a golf course, for example, might be breathing in the chemicals. Yeah. Or air pollution will lead to a nose first form of the disease.
What you're talking about is such an important concept here around the load of toxins in the gut. Yes, we eat toxins from pesticides and chemicals and ingesting all this stuff. But I think it's more than that. I read a paper years ago where there was a 4-fold increase in Parkinson's in those people who are constipated. And I don't want to scare you if you're constipated. You can fix that with magnesium and probiotics, and I've written a lot about that. But like that's a really interesting phenomena. And the I don't know if you're aware of this phenomena, but in the metabolic health, there's something called metabolic endotoxemia, which means in English that there's bad bacteria in your gut that release toxins. We call them LPSs or lipopolysaccharides, which are like little endotoxins or little poisons produced by these bacteria that we absorb across a leaky gut that interact with our immune system and cause inflammation, which then leads to insulin resistance, which then leads to weight gain, leads to diabetes. So I'm sure this metabolic endotoxemia also could be affecting the brain, not just because you're ingesting toxins, but the microbiome itself is so messed up because of our lack of fiber and polyphenols and probiotics and the use of antibiotics and so on and
so this
forth.
gets back, right, Mark, to this whole thesis of like Parkinson is a whole body disease. You're making the argument for us. And, it's really, interesting, so for almost 20 years, I've been the medical director advisor for the Parkinson's Foundation, in addition to being a professor at University of Florida. And when early on, when we started to look at websites and you and I and Ray were old enough to remember the early days where you get an analytic and you're like, oh my gosh, all these people are actually clicking on these things. Well, we actually used that, in the early days to see what people were interested in searching on the Parkinson Foundation website. And guess what kept coming up number one? Constipation. You got it, Mark. I mean, it's just sort of like, my gosh. And so fast forward now, So a couple of decades ago, Ray and I'm always the skeptic of the two. I work a lot in more of a science laboratory setting and developing devices and things. And so fast forward a couple of decades, ago, if you said to somebody Parkinson's, could be set off by a toxicant or an environment or whatever, people would say you're crazy, right? And now, as we've learned more and more, we learn about, hey, do you know what? Parkinson actually sets up many years in advance of when you mentioned movement disorder,
right.
But there are all these symptoms that are non-movement that actually, appear early. And they call them prodromal features.
So it's like pre-diabetes, but pre-Parkinson's.
Exactly. Spot on. And so these are things like, and what are they?
Yeah.
Constipation, acting out your dreams, loss of smell. You talk about the hitchhiker, and in your nose, those olfactory nerves, gut dysfunction and changes, and even some of the neuropsychiatric things. So when you see middle-aged men now, there's a study in Parkinson showing middle-aged men in their 50s suddenly start to get anxious, right? They've not been anxious before. That's, they may be the beginning of developing Parkinson symptoms. This is a whole body issue that's going on. And so I think it's important to keep those perspectives, but there's nothing crazy about constipation, Parkinson, and how it ties in.
Well, it may be both a cause and an effect, right?
Yeah, both.
It's like,
So exactly. So I think it's actually an effect of the toxin. So we mentioned that the toxin can be ingested, right? And so the enteric nervous system, which controls the gut motility.
That's the gut brain.
The gut brain. And then the highway that connects the gut to the brain is the
vagus nerve.
Vagus nerve.
How am I doing, Doc?
You're doing good. You're doing
fantastic.
Good.
Okay. So in 2003, a German pathologist, really smart guy, Heiko Brock, says Parkinson's disease, the pathology does not begin in the brain. He said Parkinson's disease, which you consider a brain disease, it does not begin in the brain. He says, I first see the pathology in the olfactory bulb, the smell center of the brain, or in the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. So he says the pathology of Parkinson's begins in the gut, and it ascends up like this misfolded protein, like a fall of dominoes. This misfolded protein spreads from one nerve cell to another. It goes from the gut up the vagus nerve, and then up from the vagus nerve to higher parts of the brain that are responsible for sleep, for controlling our blood pressure, and then only later to the part of the brain, the basal ganglia that you were talking about earlier. That constipation is actually probably is a sign that the pathology is affecting, for example, the vagus nerve, and we're getting reduced gut motility.
Is it overactive sympathetic activity?
Well, it's the damage to the parasympathetic.
So the parasympathetic. So you got imbalance. So imbalance. For those listening, you've got the fight or flight response and the relaxation response, the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. And what you're talking about here is the parasympathetic nerve that keeps you calm and relaxed. That's why anxiety increases, actually stops working as well. And you get a relative increase in the sympathetic nervous system, which then when you're running from a tiger, you don't want to be pooping. So your gut shuts down and a whole bunch of other bad stuff happens, right?
You got it.
If you love that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here.